Now, I know a lot of you out there, you're listening. You're not watching these lectures, and that's cool, but this might be a lecture that you want to watch. Now, I say that because maybe you saw the first two lectures in this series on Seminar 20. Those COVID-infused lectures, those feverish deliveries, and they were, with an attendant swirly background as well. Which is why I start there, because two of you wrote to me, a cryptic Hungarian rabbi and a well-known Brazilian psychoanalyst. You both wrote to me and you said, bro, the background. Where are the plants? It seems too uni, one of you said. Well, here we are now, and we've got a different look to experiment with as well. This look shows you once again that blackboard. It's the blackboard we're going to be working with. It's a blackboard on which we're going to be drawing. It's a blackboard on which we're going to be writing. And that very much is the theme of what we're going to get into here in this third lecture on the third chapter, the third lesson in Seminar 20. Now, I say all this because if you're listening now, you might want to push pause and head to a video feed where you can actually watch this thing. We're going to be doing enough writing that it might be worth your while to sit down and watch this lecture instead. It'll help a lot if you can hear this with your ears and see it with your eyes. It'll help even more if you can figure out a way to hear it with your eyes. But that's not how I want to begin. I want to begin by reminding you once more that the centerpiece of Lacan's thought from Seminar 17 to the opening lessons of Seminar 20, and almost certainly beyond, is the analytic discourse. As you know, we've substantially developed our clinical and conceptual understanding of this discourse since our series on Seminar 17. Most radically, I'd say, in our recent series on Ch3, that wild and woolly essay that I translate as The Forgetful Said, which Lacan penned just before starting his 20th seminar in the summer of 1972. We don't have time to rehearse it all here, but one key theme deserves mention. Up to this point, we've emphasized the productive circuitry of this analytic discourse, notably on the side of the analysand, that slashed S, that barred subject, whose sayings and saids, embodied speech events, and symptomatic statements propel this discourse, and with it, analytic experience. Now, in 1972, at the end of Seminar 19, throughout this essay Ch3, and here as well at the start of Seminar 20, Lacan is emphasizing the interpretive circuitry of the analytic discourse as well. It's not just about how things are produced in the analytic discourse. It's also about how things are interpreted in the analytic discourse. Not just the symptomatic productions of the analysand, in other words, but also the interpretive work of the analyst to keep these productions coming, if only to better account for their origins, true, real, and otherwise. In Chapter 3 of Seminar 20, which we now have before us, Lacan gives us a word for this interpretive work. He calls it reading, and with it a new line of inquiry into the function and the field of this analytic discourse that we're about to draw. If the interpretive work of the analyst involves a certain kind of reading, we must account for the role of writing, Lacan goes on to add, specifically the written in analytic discourse. And this is where things get complicated, but also quite interesting. You see, we've talked a lot about speaking and the spoken. Lacan here, still at the start of Seminar 20, is once more adding an emphasis on writing and the written, two themes which we've also encountered in recent lecture series. Now, what are we to make of all of this? Well, to start, recall what you already know about the productive circuitry of the analytic discourse. And if you have a version of the analytic discourse that you want to draw with your mind's eye or with the pen in your hand, go ahead and draw, perhaps even as I charted out here. We're going to draw in a second, but I want you to just hear, first of all, how this productive circuitry that I mentioned unfolds in the analytic discourse. I got about 7 points in this sequence. First and foremost, society begets the real. Second, the real commands unconscious truth. Third, unconscious truth produces the barred subject. Fourth, the barred subject produces speech events. Fifth, their speech events yield symptomatic statements. Sixth, the symptomatic statements that they yield help to produce the abject analyst. And last but not least, seventh, the abject analyst engages in speech events of their own, living, embodied, interpretive interventions that keep the analysand, that classic Lacanian subject, talking. This causal network is readily apparent in our latest diagram of the analytic discourse, especially through the iterations that we've put this thing, all of which are rooted in these opening flourishes of Lacan's later teaching in the early 1970s. I ask you to recall here, once more, the basic position that you see in any Lacanian discourse. We've got basic positions, 5 vectors that connect them all, or at least most of them. And it looks something like this. In the upper left-hand corner here, you have the agent. And then you have an arrow of addressivity to another, someone else, an addressee. And here you've got the basic components of any communicative interaction: speaker, speech, spoken to. This is an arrow of addressivity. Something is always produced, we've learned since Seminar 17, by these communicative exchanges, and that's really what they are. Something is produced here. This, you might say, is an effect. There's an effect of this addressivity, and we label it product in the lower right-hand quadrant. There is, however, also a cause of the agent's ability, a condition of possibility for their capacity to speak, addressing an other, resulting in the production of something, some object, some wobble for surplus enjoyment, we've learned. The cause of any given discourse is the truth atop which its agent sits. And now you've got some of these basic elements and 3 of the 5 arrows. You know this one as well. It's a return arrow from product to agent. It's an arrow that indicates surplus enjoyment. Lacan here, in the early 1970s, adds a 5th vector from truth to other, which becomes especially important as he begins to focus almost singularly on one discourse more than the others, the analytic discourse. And let's not forget the crucial element that we've been discussing for quite a while now. I change colors so you can see it. This once known as delta of impotence that we see between the cause and the effect of any given discourse. We now know that that figure of impotence has now been raised to the status of an impossibility. This indeed, my friends, is where we pin the real. Now, in the analytic discourse, you see all 4 of these positions and all of these vectors playing out in very much the same way. However, you see some terms in those four corners, giving us a sense of what exactly is different, unique, special about the analytic discourse. So in the place of the agent, we have little a. And this, again, is not the little a you think it is. This is abjection. This is abject little a. This is the position of the abject analyst. And their addressee is the same addressee we've been considering for a while. Here is your split subject. This is the barred subjectivity that speaks when the analysand opens its mouth. This is the barred subjectivity of the analysand. There's your agent, there's your other, and don't forget this is a social link. This is an exchange. Don't let that arrow of adressivity fool you. The motor force of the analytic discourse is the one who talks their way through it, mostly the analysand. In the position of product, what's produced in the analytic discourse, this is where you see the symptomatic statement. This is where we see S1 as symptomatic statement. And then in the position of truth, that which causes and conditions this discourse, we see this multifarious S2 that we've discussed so often in the past. This is simultaneously the truth of the unconscious, atop which the analyst sits. There's that vertical arrow pointing to the abject analyst. But it is also, we've learned, the unconscious truth that commands the analysand to speak. And now we've got occasion for that fifth vector that Lacan adds. Unconscious truth commanding analysand to speak, and in speaking, to state symptoms. Keeping it basic for now. We're just getting warmed up. And what about that little triangle you heard me talk about? That delta of impotence between truth and product, cause and effect. Here, S2 and S1 in the analytic discourse. Well, you know how we've been messing with this thing. This is truth's sensei. This is truth's bossy older sister. That which commands the field and the function of truth. And with it, all that follows. You see? Watch the pen. All that follows is commanded by this figure of the real. Make no mistake, all truths, those which can be said, here's your symptom, and those which can't, here's your unconscious, are subject to the real. That's what this blue marking indicates. The delta of impotence between S2 and S1, if you start following this logic and tracing this circuit, it shows that at some level, whether we're talking about the truth that can't be said, the S2, or the truth that can be said, the S1, follow the arrows and you'll see they all trace their origin back to the same place. The parts of truth, let me be clear, that cannot be said, we define as unconscious. There's your S2. The parts of truth that can be said, we define as symptomatic. There's your S1 in the diagram in front of you. And the extimate structure that commands them all is what we define as the real. Here written in blue, between S2 and S1, between the part of truth that can be said and the part of truth that cannot be said. And the extimate structure that commands these truths, once more, we define it as real. Now, if you've got eyes to see, it's the bottom half of the analytic discourse that I'm really talking about here. S2 equals the unconscious. And you know how we have defined that thing up to this point. This is the unconscious as absence. It can't be said It's ever absent in the field and function of speech, and yet commanding it. S1 here is the symptom. Its figure or its sense is not absence, but nonsense. Starting to look familiar, right? And here in the middle, with this blue delta of impotence, as we used to call it, now raised to the status of an impossibility, Lacan tells us in his report on Seminar 19, is the real. The real as that enigmatic absex sense, which is one of the strangest constructions that Lacan comes up with in this iconic year, 1972. It's from that essay, Ch3, the absex sense. So there's absence, nonsense, and between them what Lacan calls, get into the French, see if you can come up with a better translation of this, absex sense. Absex sense, because this is also, you'll soon see, where we're going to put the sexual relationship. That is no such thing. Now you can add to this that little a that I mentioned, the abject analyst. And don't forget about that slashed S of the garrulous analysand. And now suddenly you've got all the key components of the analytic discourse. All but two, that is. What's missing right now from the diagram in front of you is the analysand's embodied act of speaking and the analyst's equally embodied act of interpreting. And this is all review, so I ain't slowing down. I'm licked for this. In the analytic discourse before you, we locate the analysand's saying in that downward arrow from slashed S to S1, barred subject to symptomatic statement. And so what I'll do is I'll put a yellow star, or actually just a little dot here, so that you can know we've got something here. This is the act and fact of speaking, embodied speaking, when the barred subject as a speaking being lights out into the field of spoken discourse. That's an act. It has an evental structure. There's a facticity of this, a corporal facticity. And that's what Lacan has his eye on at the start of Seminar 20. Again, Encore, spelled E-N space C-O-R-P-S. And where do we locate the analyst's saying? Right here in the upper arrow of adressivity, from little a to slashed S, one body to another, and again, Encore. Like the real, to which both of these embodied acts of speaking appeal, the real in blue that is what the two yellow dots of embodied speech appeal to. What I want to suggest is that if you start connecting these dots to their origin, to the site where they are constantly hearkening back, to this delta of impotence raised to the status of an impossibility known as the real, what you see is that all three of these elements in the analytic discourse are structured interstitially. They are betwixt and between two different elements in the analytic discourse. Each of them is betwixt and between two other elements. The real, down here in this delta, colored blue, is a productive impasse between the subject's two truths. One which cannot be said because it's unconscious, there's your S2, and one which can be said, but only as a symptom, there's your S1. Pay attention to this structure here. And what about the analysand's embodied act of speaking? This one also, interestingly enough, if you stretch this logic out, it also takes place between unconscious truths that command the barred subject to speak, and symptomatic seds effected by these sayings. So if you follow the vector from S2 to /S to S1, you can see that the analysand's embodied act of speaking, technically speaking, is occurring between these two truths. But I think it's better to be more precise with this. More precisely, I think it's best to locate these acts of speaking between the slashed subject, that S with a line through it, and the symptom it effects. Slashed S and S1. The analysand's embodied act of speaking occurs in between. And again, note the position of the abject analyst's interpretive acts of speaking, what Lacan in Ch3 calls a second act of speaking. The analysand's discourse is what produces symptoms. The analyst discourse is what produces interpretations, and these interpretations I'm locating here, midway between abject analyst and garrulous analysand. These interpretive acts of speaking, equally embodied, are betwixt and between two other key elements in the analytic discourse, agent and other. Let me put this starkly in order to move our discussion forward. Truth and its effects are substantial, but the real and its effects are interstitial. That's an important point here. When you start looking at the logics of truth here, the return vector from S2 to /S, this is the part of truth that cannot be said and remains unknown. When you look at the return vector from S1 to a, as we learned in our last series, this signals the part of truth that can be said and can be known. At each end of these two vectors, you see a substance of sorts. The unconscious, the analysand, /S, the S1, that abject a. Let me be as clear as possible. They're all nouns. Interspersed between them, however, and interspersed between almost all of them, in the interstices between them, we don't see nouns. We encounter verbs. The embodied act of speaking, the embodied act of interpreting, and that absex sense down below, these are verbs, not nouns. They are not substances, but moments, movements, events. Tuque galore. The productive circuitry of the analytic discourse follows these moments, movements, and events from one stop to the next. Check it out. S2 to /S to S1 to abject a. Just as Lacan's one-way vectors show, and just as we've been saying for a while now, you see a productive circuit marked very clearly in the analytic discourse by the one-way direction Lacan gives to each of his vectors. What about the interpretive side of things? The interpretive work of the analyst. Here's what I would suggest, and I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be. Implicit in the interpretive work of the analyst is a retrospective reversal of the productive circuit that you can see established by these green vectors. It's a reversal of the productive circuit that has a certain kind of retroefficacy, not unlike that of the repressed's return, which, as you well know, is its only mode of existence. You know, do you remember that famous existential axiom of Kierkegaard. Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. I like that one. That one's great. And not just because I tend to read Kierkegaard with Benjamin, and Benjamin being one of the great thinkers of lives lived forward that must be understood backward. I mean, I prefer the basic fact that nobody can take a bath for you as being the great existential axiom. But this one's pretty damn good. And you know I love my boy Soren, so I gotta have this in here. Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward, he taught us. The same is true, I would add, in the clinic. Symptoms must be spoken forward, but they can only be read backward. And like that bed that Lacan imagines us to occupy, existentialists talk about baths in which only you can occupy. Note this, the psychoanalyst is here talking about a bed. And it's a bed employed to its fullest, Lacan tells us at the start of Seminar 20. There being two of you in it. Indeed, that is exactly what's going on in this analytic tango. It takes two to make it work. The analysand speaks into existence what the analyst reads back into oblivion, the symptom. And note carefully the multimedial aspect of this. The analysand speaks into existence what the analyst reads back into oblivion, the symptom. Implicit in any interpretive work worth its weight in salt, I'm suggesting, is a retrospective reading of symptomatic seds back to the embodied acts of speaking that conditioned them, and from here to the speaking body itself in all its castrative complexity, back to the unconscious truths that commanded it to open its mouth, and then from there ultimately to that sensei of it all, the real. You see the unconscious on your screen here labeled as absence. You see symptom labeled as nonsense. And I told you the real is this ab-sex sense. But you know what captures it just as well? Is the idea of a motherfucking sensei. The real is the sensei that commands the productive circuitry of analytic discourse and compels, lures, draws its interpretive reversal. This is the origin that great analysts discover. Now, when I say that the analyst reads the symptom back to this origin, back to this oblivion, I want to just be crystal clear about this. When I say they read the symptom back to oblivion, I mean they read it into the real. Where most discourses stop, whenever nonsense pops up, that of the analyst begins. Beyond the stupid, nonsensical symptom, they discover the impossible. This for Lacan is a key point and a crucial difference between any discourse known as philosophical and any discourse that he would count as psychoanalytic. In philosophical discourse, nonsense is a barrier not even worth driving over. You encounter nonsense and you turn around. It's all about cogency instead. It's all about sense made. And the best philosophers are those, of course, who take nonsense seriously. What Lacan would say is, any psychoanalyst that's going to take their work seriously will begin very much there in the field of nonsense. That is where great analytic theory and technique begins. Where philosophical discourse traditionally stops, psychoanalytic discourse in the Lacanian sense begins. Beyond the stupid, from which philosophy retreats, the Lacanian psychoanalyst discovers the impossible. And that is Lacan's object of inquiry here in this analytic discourse. Don't forget. Now, you might not have noticed all this talk in the opening chapters of Seminar 20. So let me recall some key passages for you. The first comes to us on page 22. I draw your attention to this because it's a passage we've read, but one that I think you might see a little bit differently now that you've got this diagram in front of you. It's at the top of page 22 in Seminar 20. You don't have to have the book. I'll read it for you so that your eyes, dear readers, can be focused on the diagram. And as you hear me work from noun to noun to noun, find in this diagram on the screen in front of you where you would put it. The subject, and you know where that subject goes, is precisely the one we encourage not to say it all, as we tell him in order to charm him. One cannot say it all, but rather to utter stupidities. That is key. So the subject here is that /s. And the analyst tells them, in order to charm them, which I think is quite an understatement here, not to say it all, because one cannot say it all. And this gets back to what Lacan is doing with the truth. You can't tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because only certain parts of one's own most truths can be told, can be said. S2 as unconscious, as absent, is the part of truth that cannot be said. And S1 as symptom, as nonsense, is the part of truth that can be said, but only ever as a profound slip. You can't say it all. All you can do is utter stupidities. That's what S1 is. That's why I use nonsense to describe the sense of the symptom, because it's fundamentally stupid. That is key, Lacan tells us at the top of 22. Reading on. For it is with those stupidities that we do analysis, and that we enter into the new subject, that of the unconscious. So check this out. From abject analyst to stupid symptom, to barred subject as a new subject of the unconscious, when marched back to the unconscious truth, S2, that commanded them to speak in the first place. It is precisely to the extent that the guy is willing not to think anymore that we will perhaps learn a little bit more about it, that we will draw certain consequences from his words. These D's here, these are the D's that you see in that S1. These are his words, his stupid words, his dumb, nonsensical symptoms. And they're words that cannot be taken back, for that is the rule of the game. They can't be taken back, but they can only ever, in a great analysis, be read back. From that, Lacan continues on page 22. Emerges a speaking deer. Notice the difference here. D and deer, these are key terms in Lacan's thought at this point. The symptom is what is said. These are the words spoken, the lexical content. But there is an act of speaking, the yellow dot between /s and S1. That is the deer, or the speaking. Not the said, but the speaking. Not the abstract lexical content at the level of one's word choice, perhaps. But here is the embodied act and fact of speaking. And what Lacan's saying is that when you start with the symptom in all its stupidity and start working backwards, here, in this backwards working, there emerges a speaking that conditioned the spoken here. From that emerges a speaking that does not always go so far as to be able to exist with respect to the words spoken. Now, I think, on the contrary, more often than not, when looked at carefully, the embodied act and fact of a subject speaking does indeed exist. Lacan's making a point here, though, that it gets wrapped up all too closely with the words, these stupid words spoken, the said, so much so that we don't allow these acts and facts of speaking in all their corporal scrappiness to exist. We'll come back to that in a minute because I think it's worth surgically getting in there and seeing if we can separate these two often convoluted elements. Reading on. That is because of what gets included in those words as a consequence thereof. That is the acid test by which, in analyzing anyone, no matter how stupid, a certain real may be reached. The status of the saying, dear. I must leave all of that aside for today. But that's okay, because it's this last bit about arriving at a certain real that catches our attention. So bear with me here and walk these vectors back. The analyst does their interpretive work by moving from the stupid symptom and all its nonsense to the act and fact of embodied speaking at the behest of an inscribed body known as that /s, that speaking subject, who is in turn commanded by an unconscious, who is in turn bossed around by that older sister, that sensei, that elder teacher known as the real. This is the wager. Good Lacanian psychoanalysis can start with a symptom and not just trace it back to the unconscious truth that produced it, but go even further back to the sensei of the unconscious itself, a certain real. So there you have it. From stupid symptoms to acts of saying to embodied subjects to unconscious truths to a certain real. This is the acid test of the analyst's interpretive work, which makes you, dear analysand, a reader as well. Now, I don't want to fuck around too much. My goal here is to just stay focused on the material, but you know how things get. It's hard not to think of you, dear analysand, as a reader at this point as well. Lacan, though, with regard to this interpretive circuitry, not surprisingly, our boy returns to the topic at the start of Chapter 3 in Seminar 20. And this time, he's explicit about this readerly work that the abject analyst engages in. It's a few pages forward from the one you just heard me read from. It starts on page 26 up to the top of page 27. This one we ain't talked about before, but you will immediately notice the resonance. You'll also notice the difference that comes with this resonance. In analytic discourse, Lacan says, what is involved is but that which is read. That which is read beyond what you have incited the subject to say, which, as I emphasized last time, is not so much to say everything as to say anything without worrying about saying something stupid. That assumes that we develop the dimension of stupidity, but it cannot be developed without the act of saying. What is the dimension of stupidity? That dimension that Lacan has been talking about. D spelled D-I-T, referring to what is said, which ought to point you to that S1 as symptom. What is this dimension of stupidity? Stupidity, at least the stupidity one can proffer, doesn't go far. In common discourse, it stops short. And in common analysis, so also does our dear analyst. Now, in case you arrived late to this lesson of Lacan's, because remember, we're reading on page 26 to 27, it's right at the start of his third lesson. Presumably, the lecture has just begun, and this is the first shit out of his mouth, or thereabouts. What happens if you were late? What if you were late to that particular session? In case you were late to this particular session, Lacan repeats himself at the end of chapter 3, at the end of his third lesson in Seminar 20, and he drills down again into the readerly work of analysis. This passage is a little bit longer. He really wants to drive this point home about the readerly work of analysis. Notice how he sets this whole thing up. I'll read the whole passage to you, even if I happen to die along the way, because this thing really is a full page or so out of the book. It's worth your attention. If you've got the book, grab it and read along. If not, close your eyes and just allow your mind to drift along and your car to weave in and out of the lanes as you suddenly find, no, don't close your eyes, but do open your ears. Lacan here is fucking with seeing and hearing, and we, following his lead, will also. You must sit down and read, Lacan says at the bottom of page 36. A little work by writers, not of your era. I won't tell you to read Philippe Solaire's, who is unreadable, like me, as a matter of fact. But you could read Joyce, for example. You will see therein how language is perfected when it knows how to play with writing. I can agree that Joyce's work is not readable. It is certainly not translatable into Chinese. What happens in Joyce's work? The signifier stuffs the signified. And note Bruce's translator's footnote here. This could literally mean to garnish it with truffles, but I think Lacan means it more figuratively, as in to stuff, to lard, to fill, and even to pepper. The signifier peppers the signified. It is because the signifiers fit together, Lacan continues, combine and concertina, read Finnegan's Wake, that something is produced by way of meaning, that may seem enigmatic, but is clearly what is closest to what we analysts, thanks to analytic discourse, have to read. Slips of the tongue. It is as slips that they signify something, in other words, that they can be read in an infinite number of different ways. But it is precisely for that reason that they are difficult to read, are read awry, or not read at all. But doesn't this dimension of being read suffice to show that we are in the register of analytic discourse? What is at stake in analytic discourse is always the following. You give a different reading to the signifiers that are enunciated than what they signify. We'll come back to this passage and discuss it, so just hang tight, because now we get to some wild, wonderful Lacanian riffs. To make myself understood, and presumably this is Lacan trying to be as clear, coherent, and accessible as possible. To make myself understood, he says, so get ready, it's going to become incredibly clear what it is he's up to. I will take a reference you read in the great book of the world. Consider the flight of the bee. A bee goes from flower to flower gathering nectar. What you discover is that at the tip of its feet, the bee transports pollen from one flower on to the pistil of another flower. That is what you read in the flight of the bee. In the flight of a bird that flies close to the ground, you call that a flight, but in reality it is a group at a certain level. You read that there is going to be a storm. But do they read? Does the bee read that it serves a function in the reproduction of the phanerogamic plants? Does the bird read the portent of fortune, as people used to say? In other words, the tempest. That is the whole question. It cannot be ruled out, after all, that a swallow reads the tempest, but it is not terribly certain either. In your analytic discourse, you assume that the subject of the unconscious knows how to read. And this business of the unconscious is nothing other than that. Not only do you assume that it knows how to read, but you assume that it can learn how to read. The only problem is that what you teach it to read has absolutely nothing to do, in any case, with what you can write of it. Well, if that doesn't help us absolutely come up with a better understanding of what Lacan is doing here with difficult to read, reading awry, all those slips of the tongue, I don't know what will. I love it when he flits into bees, into birds, into tempests. This is a great writer of nature, a great thinker of that Umwelt that so many Germans fancied themselves the best at. Now, this passage at the end of chapter 3, Lacan's third lesson in Seminar 20, is one I'm sure we're going to be chopping up at our next live discussion of this series. Now, maybe by the time you're listening to this, that session has passed. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, reach out, join the next session. If the whole series has passed, feel free to drop a line. I think this is a fascinating topic. It reminds me of the jouissance of the plant. It reminds me of what he's said about beavers and oysters as well. Lacan's animals, such a terrific through line in his work. Since I know we're going to be talking about this passage in the days, weeks, and perhaps months to come, let me just highlight a few key points, things I'm reading, noticing in this text. Now, let's start simple. When Lacan says lapsus, he means parapraxis. He means a slip of the tongue, a slip of the pen, a slip of the mind, you name it, even and especially when you forget. And when slips of this sort are commanded by unconscious truths, we have another name for them: symptoms. Not all slips of the tongue are symptoms. They may be resonant with the unconscious, but are they commanded by its truth? A parapraxis commanded by the truth of the unconscious is a symptom. Here, again, we're talking about that stupid symptom, that S1 in the lower right-hand corner of the discourse drawn on the blackboard in this lecture. Which brings us to another key point of chapter 3 in Seminar 20 here. This S1 that Lacan is talking about in his final flourish is indeed, as he is alluding to it, it's a signifier. S1 is a signifier. And you've heard the work that we did in our last couple of series, notably Seminar 19 series, where we talked about the S1 in the analytic discourse and its difference from the S1 in the master's discourse. And it's a numerical difference. The signifier S1 in the master's discourse is always feigning a signifier 1. There is oneness, and I am it, the master sounds off. In the case of the symptom, however, that nonsensical S1 in the lower right-hand corner of the analytic discourse, the number is not 1, but 2. There is more to me than I can say. And that is the part worth focusing on. I'm not the one. The unconscious is, the symptom tells us. Now, you heard that in a previous series. I'm going to leave it at that, knowing that you can go back and track it down if you're curious about that. It's toward the end of our series on Seminar 19, if memory serves. What I want to do, though, is point out and help you make sense of what Lacan is doing with the symptom as a signifier here in Seminar 20. And I want to do this as crisply as possible. In spoken discourse, the signifier has three parts. It has a source, a sound, and if you're lucky, a meaning. It has a body that speaks, an event of saying, and a signified effect. Source, sound, meaning. Body, event, effect. Here, their relation is sequential. The body precedes every act of saying. And every act of saying, a signifier, precedes any formation of effect known as a signified. Bodies precede sayings, sayings precede signifiers, and signifiers precede signifieds. Push pause, think about it for a second. All we're really doing is talking about what you know in your bones to happen at the beginning, middle, and end of any social exchange. Bodies precede sayings, sayings precede signifiers, and signifiers precede signifieds. I want to suggest, though, that their relationship is not just sequential. It is also multimodal, or as you heard me say a moment ago, multimedial. Let me tell you what I mean by this. In spoken discourse, where bodies speak, signifiers appeal to the ears. Signifiers are heard in spoken discourse. But signifieds are for the eyes. They are not heard, but read. Signifiers appeal to the ears. They are heard. But signifieds are for the eyes. They are not heard, but read. Hear me now. The interpretive work of our dear analyst consists in reading the signifiers that they hear. This is why I say multimodal and multimedial. Great analysts are skilled at reading signifiers that they hear. Lacan is outspoken on this point. I doubt you missed this passage, even if your eyes glazed over when you encountered it. It's on page 33. This one didn't catch my attention the first time through, but by the end, in the longer passage I read to you about the birds and the bees, my friends, this one, in hindsight, made a lot more sense. Check it out. It's on page 33. The signified has nothing to do with the ears, but only with reading. The reading of the signifiers we hear. The signified is not what you hear. What you hear is the signifier. The signified is the effect of the signifier. This is why, I think, reading symptoms in Lacanian psychoanalytic theory and technique is about reading them awry, as he tells us at the end of his third lesson. To read a symptom is to see beyond it with one's ears, to realize how it's saying, in all of its evental sonic features, homonymic and otherwise, stuffs its signified. The task here is a certain type of reading. Reading symptoms requires that you're able to see beyond what you hear, and to realize how this saying that you're hearing in all of its evental sonic dimensions stuffs the signified. that your eyes are always drawn to. Remember, peppers, lards, stuffs is the translation that Bruce gives to Lacan's account of what it is that Joyce is doing. His signifiers stuff his signifieds. I think this is what Lacan means when he says at the end of his third lesson in Seminar 20, you give a different reading to the signifiers that are enunciated than what they signify. Let me try and be clear. Between the sound of a signifier at the level of its saying and its signified at the level of what is said, there is always, for Lacan, a slippage of sorts. And it's here, at this point of slippage, that the interpretive work of the analyst begins. But also, all too often, and please forgive me, dear analysts, many of which are my friends, this is also where your efforts often go astray, according to Lacan. This is what L'étourdi, that forgetful said essay, is all about, and probably why so few people have tried to read it. This is also why Lacan, however, begins Seminar 20 with the central claim of that essay. The fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. And don't forget, in Lacan's French, heard can also mean understood. Key point to hold in mind, and one we've covered before. In spoken discourse, I told you the signifier has three parts: a bodily source, an evental sound, and a signified effect. Being, saying, and meaning, and exactly in this order. The issue here is one of hearing, but also, if you think about it, seeing. When analysts go astray, they hear meaning, not being, in the signifier. They hear what is said when the analysand speaks more than they hear the analysand's act of embodied speech. In other words, the analyst, when they go astray, loses sight of what is right before their eyes, a speaking body, that of the analysand, because they have trained their ears to hear only what is said by this body, namely its meaning, qua signified. They have ears to hear the evental sound of the analysand's signifiers, but no eyes to see the bodily source of these signifiers. And thus, as a result, no ability to read what is written there on the body. Once more, the truth of the analyst astray shows itself, just as we've learned since our series on Seminar 19 and just as I've told you in previous lectures. They are corporally illiterate. This is the truth of analysis astray. It shows us more often than not, Lacan is wagering, an analyst who is corporally illiterate, unable to read, much less see the body. Again and again, there's one encore, they fail to account for the body. Right in front of them, there's the other encore. To say nothing of the body's function as a figure of the real, that great certain real that is the origin, the sensei, to which great interpretation trends. And all the more so when the consulting room has become a video conference. Analysis astray is part and parcel of analysis in the age of Zoom, where most, if not all, of the key nonverbal channels Proxemics, kinesics, haptics, even olfactics are narrowed to the point of illegibility. When you conduct analysis via Zoom, via video conference, hell, even just over the phone, the dilemma of that, according to Lacan, is that you narrow the nonverbal channels so crucial when bodies meet in person, Encore, proxemics, kinesics, haptics, olfactics. Hell, if all you're doing is having a phone call with somebody, oculesics is also removed. You can't even see what their eyes are doing. They're narrowed to the point of illegibility because, check it out, if you think about this carefully, they're illegible because they are indiscernible when the consulting room becomes a video conference. Okay. I'm done. I swear I'm done. Enough about analysts astray. Let's talk about those who walk the path instead. And ever at the behest of their analysans, speaking beings, all as figures of an impossible real that stalks each of us through the night. If good analysts are attuned readers, I would like to suggest that the best analysans are atonal writers. And they're not alone. This is Lacan's point about the birds and the bees. Birds, bees, and the best analysans, they don't read, they write. And wildly so. The bee's journey from flower to flower, the swallow's swooping flight before the storm, the analysan's embodied act of speaking as commanded by the unconscious who works at the behest of a sensei we know not. These all function as a certain kind of writing, as proven by the fact that all of these movements can be read. The proof that the bee's journey and the swallow's swoop and the analysan's saying function as writing is that all of these movements can be read. Which is why, note this, at the start of chapter 3, in the passage we considered, Lacan is not talking about reading per se. He's talking about that which is read. Not reading, but that which is read. This, he says, is what's involved in analytic discourse. Note how careful he is about putting this. It's about that which is read. To be sure, reading backwards with one's ears is what's involved in the analyst's interpretive work. But in the discourse where this work occurs, it's about that which is read, a field and function of the written that every act of reading presupposes. Now, that sounds smart, right? No, it's just a stupid statement. Just think simply about this. The logic here is stupid. You know this in your bones. In order to read something, you must first have access to something written. It's as simple as that. That's how Lacan is thinking here. Note also, it's at the level of a presupposition. Reading presupposes the written. And this, the written, ain't got nothing to do with the signifier, as introduced by linguistics and upended by Lacan. I call your attention to page 29. One-liner. The written is in no way in the same register or made of the same stuff, if you'll allow me this expression, as the signifier. Signifiers provoke understanding, delusionally so. But what is written, Lacan continues on page 34, is not to be understood. Explained? Yes. But understood? No. Why not? because all that is written stems from a certain impossibility. An impossibility to write a certain real that Lacan calls exactly what it is you think he's going to call it, the sexual relationship. It's on page 35. He's working up to what makes Seminar 20 famous in these opening riffs. Everything that is written stems from the fact that it will forever be impossible to write as such the sexual relationship. It is on that basis that there is a certain effect of discourse, which is called writing. Dear men, we are signifiers whose enjoyment can be wholly written, read, and I dare say even understood. Dear women, we are signifiers whose enjoyment can be partially, but not wholly, written, read, and I dare say understood. But that sexual relationship that ever eludes us both, even and especially when we squeeze each other tight, as Lacan quips at the start of Seminar 20. This sexual relationship is not a signifier that can be written or read, spoken or heard, by eyes or ears alike, much less understood. Which is why, if you think about it, we never stop writing and reading and talking about the sexual relationship. It's because it can't be written that we never stop writing about it. Emphasis here, though, on the word about. About is not the same as the as such you heard Lacan use in the passage I just read about the sexual relationship. You can talk and write and read about the sexual relationship, but it is impossible to talk and write and read the sexual relationship as such. This is Lacan's fine point. And you see him making it again, the bottom of page 35, top of page 36, just where we were reading a few lines down. You'll never be able to write the sexual relationship, he continues. Write it with a true writing, insofar as the written is that aspect of language that is conditioned by a discourse. This sexual relationship, it only exists as a name of the impossible in the discourse of the real, which is to say, and please, let me just say it, the analytic discourse. What is the analytic discourse? It is the discourse of the real. In analytic discourse, the real has a name, a voice as well. Does it also have a pen? How about reading glasses? In the analytic discourse in front of you, the real has a name. It's got a voice too. Yellow dotted voices. But does it also have a pen? And how about reading glasses? Let me just cut to the chase. I don't mean to fuck around. What is written in the analytic discourse? What exactly is written in the analytic discourse? And here, I'm not asking about its written formula that you see in front of you, about its function as a matheme with 4 variables, 5 vectors, 8 vertices, and 3 interrelated existents, which insist there ever from without as a series of impasses. I ain't talking about what you're seeing on the screen right now. In fact, I think the answer to this question is much simpler than this. What's written in the analytic discourse is the scene of writing that we've been talking about ever since Derrida turned us on to Freud's 52nd letter to Fliess. We're talking about the unconscious. What's written in the analytic discourse is the unconscious. And we always write it the same as S2 in the lower left-hand corner of the diagram on your screen right now. What then, because stupidity is the name of our game, is the unconscious? It's a scene of writing and constant revision commanded by an impossibility that it never stops scribbling about the sexual relationship, qua real, qua sensei. The unconscious is the little sister who never stops talking about her seniors. And what does the unconscious write when it writes about this sexual relationship that is no such thing? It writes letters. The unconscious is structured like a language, not just because it's full of signifiers. That's a red herring. Give up on that shit. It's structured like a language because it's also, at base, an assemblage of letters. Open a dictionary and what do you see? A bunch of signifiers. Look carefully. Zoom in on a word. Get a magnifying glass out. Hell, get a microscope out. What you see on the page is in fact letters strung together, an assemblage of letters. And what do you see beyond the letter? What do you see beyond the letter when you get out that microscope? A dent in the page, a particle of a tree, a spill and splosh of ink. What you see is materiality, which is its own type of letter. You see where we're going with this. But I want to focus on the letters that we see in the unconscious. It's structured like a language because it is an assemblage of letters, just like any language. But what kind of letters? You know the kind I was just alluding to, right? Little A's and B's and C's and S's with slashes through them and oh, those letters? Yeah, those letters. But what I want to suggest at the end of this lecture is that these aren't the kind of letters, figuratively speaking, that you see assembled in the unconscious. The letters of the unconscious are not the ones you might think. The letters that comprise the unconscious are all, at root, love letters. Love letters addressed to speaking subjects about what cannot be written, the sexual rapport. From S2 to /S in the diagram in front of you, this is what you see. And we can't stop there. We shouldn't stop there. You've often heard me describe the symptom as a love letter as well. It's time to connect these dots. Why have I said this about the symptom? Why have I likened the symptom to a love letter? Because as the part of one's own most truth that can be said, the symptom never stops talking about, fawning over, and pining after what it ain't, namely, the part of truth that cannot be said, which we denote as, you guessed it, the unconscious. The symptom is not the scene of writing that commanded the subject to speak it into existence. Hence, the common refrain that if you look hard at every symptom, if you listen carefully with that microscope of yours, you'll hear the same thing. I ask you to refuse me my offering because this is not it. And what do we mean by that? If we could translate it a little bit, in keeping with the work we did with it in our last series on Seminar 19, or worse. Refuse me my offering. Why? Because the symptomatic statement I'm presenting here in analysis as the part of my own most truth that can be said is not the unconscious truth that commanded me to pronounce it. An unconscious truth that I am powerless to state. It's for this reason that I ask you, dear analyst, to look elsewhere, to read beyond my symptomatic statement. Note the parallels here, if you haven't already. The symptom is a love letter about unconscious truths that cannot be said. And these unconscious truths are themselves love letters about a sexual rapport that cannot be written. What about that damn speaking being in between? That damned and barred subjectivity between S2 and S1 in the analytic discourse on your screen right now. The one which harkens back beyond unconscious truth to an impossible real that is their own. If unconscious love letters command symptomatic love letters, and symptomatic love letters are always recalling unconscious love letters, what's the analysand in all of this? That classic Lacanian subject, neurotic through and through, that we denote with a slashed S in the upper right-hand corner of the diagram on your screen. The analysand between these two fields of love writing is a letter carrier. Neither author nor addressee, if you think about it. The analysand is a messenger. Let me explain. In analytic experience, the neurotic subject is commanded by the unconscious to cough up symptoms. The part of unconscious truth that cannot be said compels them to state the part of unconscious truth that can be said. And when properly hystericized, the analysand reverses this process, commanding their symptoms to cough up their original unconscious commandments. And now you'd have to see the discourse of the hysteric to make better sense of this. I'll write it up here in a different color, just very quickly so that you can see what this thing looks like. And I'm going to write it in the classic way because it's the way that you've seen it the most. This is what I mean when I say properly hystericized, the analysand reverses the process. They are now interrogating their symptoms, S1, and forcing them to cough up their original unconscious commandments. And those unconscious coughings up are what the analysand is getting off on when hystericized. The analysand here is addressing or interrogating their symptoms, the same symptoms you saw down here, but now with an opportunity to compel them to cough up the unconscious truths atop which they sit. I think you see where we're going with this. It's a topic we've discussed numerous times. And all of which has me thinking about this barred subject in the discourse of the analyst. It's the same barred subject that you see when hystericized, and this S1 is the same S1 that you see addressed by the hysteric. And I look at this barred subject in the analytic discourse between these two fields and functions of love at the sign of a letter. Holy shit. And I think to myself, what a matchmaker. Oh, this neurotic subject, this clinical cupiditas, what a matchmaker, a messenger of love, bringing truths together in holy matrimony till death do they part since the birth of the Lacanian clinic. This is an easy quip to make, but I also, in the final analysis, find it quite enigmatic. Lacan starts Seminar 20 by telling us that the jouissance of the other, by which he means the jouissance of the body of the other sex, is not a sign of love. He repeats this saying at the start of chapter 4. But here, at the end of our reading of chapter 3, I'm reminded of another axiom of his at the start of Seminar 20. And it goes like this. Love is the sign that one is changing discourses. And I ask you, my friends, how else does that love messenger, that clinical cupiditas, do their work? By changing discourses, from that of the analyst to that of the hysteric, and then ideally back to that of the analyst. If love is the sign that one is changing discourses, maybe the Lacanian subject is its referent. Which, of course, begs another question, a fundamental question that's been with us since the start of this series. What kind of love are we talking about here?